There is a phrase that Michel Foucault discovered that, when spoken at the right moment, instantly destroys any attempt at manipulation. It's not magic. It's not self-help. It's a psychological mechanism so powerful that it exposes the invisible structure of power operating in every conversation, every relationship, every social interaction. And once you understand it, you will never be controlled in the same way again. But here's the danger that Foucault documented extensively. Most people who learn this phrase use it the wrong way, and in doing so, surrender even more power to manipulators. Because the true power of this discovery isn't in the words themselves, but in understanding how power actually works. Foucault spent decades studying prisons, psychiatric hospitals, schools, and religious confessionals. He discovered something terrifying. The most effective systems of control are not those that use brute force. They are those that make you police yourself, judge yourself, control yourself without ever realizing you're being manipulated. He called this disciplinary power, and it's operating on you right now, at this very moment, in ways you cannot see. I'm about to reveal the exact phrase that Foucault identified as the most powerful weapon against manipulation. Why it works on a psychological level that manipulators cannot circumvent, and how to use it without becoming what you're fighting against. But first, you need to understand something crucial about how power actually operates. Most people think power is something someone has over you. Your boss has power because they can fire you. Your parents had power because they were bigger and stronger. The government has power because it has police and prisons. This is the traditional view of power. Foucault called it the sovereign model of power, and he spent his entire career proving it's completely wrong. Here's what Foucault discovered that changed everything. Power is not something someone possesses. It's something that circulates. It's a relationship, not a possession. And the most effective systems of power are those where you voluntarily participate in your own domination without ever realizing you're doing it. Think about it. No one forces you to check your social media 50 times a day. No one compels you to constantly compare yourself to others. No one threatens you to make you seek external validation, and yet you do it. Why? Because modern power doesn't operate through repression. It operates through production. It produces desires, produces behaviors, produces even the kind of person you think you are. Foucault studied how prisons were designed in the 19th century. He discovered something called the panopticon, a prison structure where prisoners never know if they're being watched, but act as if they're always being surveilled. Here's the revolutionary insight. Eventually, prisoners begin to watch themselves. They internalize the gaze of authority. They become their own guard. The prison no longer needs to force them to obey because they're already policing themselves. Now look at your life. How many times do you censor yourself before you even speak? How many times do you judge your own thought? How many times do you feel guilty about desires that no one ever explicitly said were wrong? How many times do you act a certain way not because someone is forcing you, but because you've internalized what is appropriate, normal, acceptable? You're living in an invisible panopticon, and you don't even notice. Foucault identified what he called technologies of the self. These are practices, rituals, and discourses that teach you to constantly examine yourself, constantly judge yourself, constantly correct yourself. Religious confessionals, where you reveal your sins. Therapy sessions, where you analyze your flaws. Performance reviews, where you justify your existence. Social media posts, where you perform a carefully edited version of yourself. All of these are technologies of the self. They don't repress who you are, they produce who you become. And here's the truly disturbing part. You do this voluntarily. In fact, you pay for it. You pay therapists to examine you. You pay gyms to discipline your body. You pay coaches to optimize your performance. No one is forcing you. You're actively participating in systems that transform you into a certain kind of subject, a productive subject, a manageable subject, a subject who never questions the fundamental structures governing your existence. Foucault called this governmentality, the art of governing not through force, but by making people govern themselves according to norms they never consciously chose, but have accepted as natural, obvious, inevitable. Think about how you talk about yourself. I should be more productive. I should be more confident. I should be more successful. I should. Who said you should? Where do these shoulds come from? They're not yours. They were installed in you by systems of power that benefit when you internalize their demand. Now, before you think Foucault was just being pessimistic, here's where it gets interesting. Foucault didn't believe power was inherently bad. He believed power was productive. It creates things. It produces knowledge, produces identities, produces possibilities. The problem isn't power itself. The problem is when power operates invisibly, when you don't notice how you're being shaped, when you mistake the effects of power for your authentic nature. And this is where the phrase comes in. But to understand it, you first need to recognize the three main strategies that manipulators use, that Foucault exposed in his work. Strategy 1. Normalization. Manipulators make you believe there's a normal way to be, and if you don't fit that normality, there's something wrong with you. They establish standards, create categories, define what is healthy, what is mature, what is rational, and then they measure you against those standards. Foucault showed how this operates everywhere. In medicine, where your body is compared to statistical norms. In psychology, where your mind is evaluated against definitions of sanity. In education, where your intelligence is ranked on scales. In relationships, where your behavior is judged as mature or immature. Normalization isn't just description. It's prescription. It doesn't just say how things are, it says how things should be. And once you accept the norm, you begin to police yourself to conform to it. Strategy 2. Constant examination. Manipulators create situations where you're constantly being observed, evaluated, judged, and eventually you internalize that gaze. You begin to observe yourself, evaluate yourself, judge yourself. Foucault studied how psychiatric hospitals kept detailed records of every patient behavior, how schools constantly test and grade students, how employers monitor and evaluate workers, how social media tracks and analyzes every click, every like, every moment of attention. The examination transforms you into a case, a data set, an object of knowledge. And the more you're examined, the more you become that object. You begin to see yourself through the eyes of the examiners. Strategy 3. Confession. Manipulators make you reveal your innermost thoughts, feelings, desires, and fears. And then they use those revelations to control you. Foucault traced this from religious confessionals to modern psychoanalysis. Confession is not liberating, it's a technology of power. When you confess, you make your interior visible. You allow others to define what your revelations mean. You surrender the power to interpret your own experience. Think about how our culture is obsessed with authenticity, with being real, with sharing your truth. It seems liberating, but Foucault would ask, who benefits when you constantly reveal your inner self? Who gains power when you make your psychological life transparent and analyzable? Now, we arrive at the crucial point, the phrase that Foucault identified that destroys these strategies. But before revealing it, you need to understand that it's not the literal words that matter. It's the attitude, the philosophical posture, the shift in perspective that the phrase represents. Because Foucault wasn't interested in slogans, he was interested in practices of freedom, ways of relating to yourself and others that resist domination without creating new forms of domination. The phrase isn't a magic formula. It's an interruption, a cut in the normal flow of power, a refusal to participate in the games that manipulators play. And here it is. The phrase is simply, I don't accept the terms of this conversation. It sounds simple. It sounds almost trivial. But let me explain why this is devastating to manipulators and why it works on a level they cannot circumvent. When a manipulator tries to control you, they establish the terms of engagement. They define the problem. They frame the question. They decide which categories are relevant, which norms apply, which outcomes are possible. And if you accept those terms, if you enter the conversation within their framework, you've already lost, because the framework itself contains the power. Let me give specific examples. Someone says, "You're being too sensitive." This establishes sensitivity as a problem, as something to be corrected. If you respond by defending your level of sensitivity or trying to prove you're not sensitive, you've accepted the terms. You've agreed that sensitivity is something to be measured and judged. Instead, you say, "I don't accept the terms of this conversation." You're not defending yourself. You're not arguing. You're refusing the entire framework where sensitivity is constructed as a flaw. Someone says, "You need to be more productive." This establishes productivity as the standard by which your value is measured. If you respond by trying to prove you're productive or promising to be more productive, you've accepted the terms. You've agreed that your value is determined by your output. You say, "I don't accept the terms of this conversation." You're not rejecting productivity itself. You're rejecting the framework that reduces human existence to production metrics. Someone says, "Normal people don't do that." This establishes normality as the authority determining acceptable behavior. If you respond by trying to prove you're normal or defending your deviation from normality, you've accepted the terms. You've agreed that normality is the relevant standard. You say, "I don't accept the terms of this conversation." You're not arguing about what's normal. You're rejecting normality as a relevant category of judgment. You see the pattern? The phrase isn't about winning the argument within the established framework. It's about refusing the framework itself. It's about exposing that the framework isn't neutral, isn't natural, isn't inevitable. It's a construction of power, and you're not obliged to inhabit it. Foucault called this critique. Not critique in the sense of complaining or judging. Critique in the sense of questioning the conditions of possibility. Asking, how did this way of thinking become possible? What structures of power support it? What kind of subject does it produce? And crucially, could it be otherwise? When you say, "I don't accept the terms of this conversation," you're doing several things simultaneously. First, you're revealing that the terms aren't neutral. They're not just the obvious way to frame the question. They're a specific choice that serves specific interests. Second, you're refusing the role that was assigned to you in the manipulator's game. They wanted you to be the defendant defending yourself, the student being evaluated, the patient being diagnosed. You're not going to play that part. Third, you're creating a space for different terms to emerge, terms that you choose consciously instead of accept unconsciously. And fourth, you're demonstrating what Foucault called courage of truth, the willingness to speak in a way that challenges structures of power, even when it creates discomfort, even when you pay a social price for it. But here's the crucial part that most people miss. This phrase is not a weapon to be used in every disagreement. It's not an excuse to avoid all forms of accountability. It's not a way to be stubborn or contrary on principle. Foucault was very clear about this. Resistance to power doesn't mean rejecting all power. It means resisting specific forms of domination. Power relations where your capacity to determine your own conduct is systematically constrained. So you don't say, "I don't accept the terms of this conversation," whenever someone disagrees with you. You say it when you recognize that the framework of the conversation itself is manipulative, when the terms have been established in a way that makes it impossible for you to express yourself authentically, when you're being forced into a position that serves someone else's interests, not yours. How do you know the difference? Foucault offered some criteria. A conversation is manipulative when there's an asymmetry of power that isn't acknowledged. When one person is positioned as the authority who judges, evaluates, or defines, and the other is positioned as the object being judged, evaluated, or defined. The terms of conversation were established unilaterally. One person decided which questions are relevant, which categories apply, which outcomes are acceptable, without negotiation or agreement. The framework of conversation makes it impossible for you to articulate your own perspective. No matter what you say within those terms, you're confirming the framework that subordinates you. There's an attempt to make you confess, reveal yourself, become transparent in ways that put you at a disadvantage. There's an invocation of norms, standards, or expectations as if they were natural or obvious, when actually they're choices serving specific interests. arrogance. When you recognize these patterns, that's when the phrase has power, but you have to use it wisely because, and this is Foucault's deepest insight, you can use this phrase in a way that reproduces exactly the structures of power you're trying to resist. If you say, "I don't accept the terms of this conversation," with arrogance, with contempt, with a sense of moral superiority, you're just creating a new form of domination. You're establishing yourself as the authority who decides which terms are acceptable. You're using the language of power critique as a form of power over others. Foucault warned against this repeatedly. He saw how liberation movements often reproduced the structures they claimed to reject, how those who resisted domination often became new dominators, how the language of freedom could be co-opted into new forms of control. So how do you use the phrase correctly? You say it calmly, without arrogance. You're not declaring yourself superior. You're simply refusing a particular framework. You offer an alternative. You don't just reject their terms. You propose different terms that don't subordinate either party. You acknowledge your own complicity. You admit that you too are positioned within structures of power. You too carry assumptions that might be subordinating others. You remain open. You don't treat your refusal as final. You allow the possibility that you might be wrong, that the terms you're rejecting might be more complex than you initially realized. And you focus on structure, not person. You're not attacking the manipulator as a person. You're identifying a pattern of power operating through both of you. This last point is crucial. Foucault didn't believe in villains. He didn't think there were malicious manipulators scheming to control innocent people. He believed power operates through all of us, that we all participate in power relations, that we're all simultaneously exercising power and subject to power. The goal isn't to find and punish manipulators. The goal is to make structures of power visible so they can be questioned, challenged, and transformed. When you say, "I don't accept the terms of this conversation," you're not accusing the other person of being a manipulator. You're pointing to a structure operating between you, and you're inviting them, in that moment, to recognize that structure and build something different together. But what happens when you say this? Foucault observed some consistent patterns. If the person was actually trying to manipulate you, they often react with escalation. They get louder, more insistent, more aggressive. They try to force you back into the framework. They might accuse you of being difficult, irrational, defensive. This confirms you correctly identified a manipulative framework. They're disturbed precisely because you went off script. If the person wasn't trying to manipulate but was simply operating within unconscious structures, they often get confused. They don't understand why you're rejecting terms that seem obvious to them. This opens a possibility for different dialogue, a conversation about the structures themselves. Some people get curious. They ask what you mean. What terms would you accept? How would you frame this differently? This is the best possible response because it indicates willingness to negotiate the structure itself. And some people simply walk away. They realize you won't play the usual games, so they lose interest. This might seem like a loss, but Foucault would say it's a liberation. You filtered out relationships that could only exist through your subordination. Now here's something that surprises most people. Foucault didn't believe you should avoid all power relationships. He thought it was impossible. Power relations are constitutive of social life. They're everywhere. The goal isn't to eliminate them, but to make them more fluid, more reversible, more open to contestation. A good power relation, in Foucault's view, is one where both parties can question the terms, where power isn't fixed in one direction, where there's freedom to resist, to negotiate, to transform the relation. A bad power relation is one where the terms become fixed, where one party consistently subordinates the other, where there's no space to question the fundamental structure. So when you say, "I don't accept the terms of this conversation," you're not trying to eliminate power relations. You're trying to make them mobile again. You're introducing the possibility that they could be different. Let me give some more specific examples of how this works in practice. Imagine you have a boss who constantly frames conversations in terms of your inadequacy. You're not meeting expectations. You need to improve. you're falling short. The terms already establish you as deficient and your boss as the standard by which deficiency is measured. You could say, I don't accept the terms of this conversation. I'd like to discuss whether the expectations are reasonable, whether I have the necessary resources, and whether we're measuring things that actually matter. You shifted from a conversation about your inadequacy to a conversation about the evaluation structure itself. Imagine you have a partner who always frames conflicts in terms of who's right and who's wrong. The terms already establish that there's a correct answer, and someone needs to admit error. You could say, I don't accept the terms of this conversation. I don't think this is about right and wrong. I think this is about different needs and about finding a way to honor both. You shifted from a conversation about judgment to a conversation about understanding. Imagine you have a parent who frames conversations in terms of maturity. You're not being mature. Mature people would do this. When are you going to grow up? The terms establish the parent as the authority on what constitutes maturity. You could say, I don't accept the terms of this conversation. I don't think maturity means agreeing with you. I think it means making conscious choices about my own life. You shifted from a conversation about development to a conversation about autonomy. In each case, you're not just disagreeing with content. You're identifying and refusing the framework that makes the content possible. You're doing what Foucault called critique. You're questioning the conditions under which certain statements become possible. But here's the deeper challenge, and this is where Foucault's work gets truly radical. You also need to use this phrase with yourself, because the most insidious form of manipulation doesn't come from others. It comes from the way you've internalized structures of power and now use them to police yourself. How many conversations do you have with yourself where you accept terms that subordinate you? I should be more productive. Why did you accept productivity as the standard by which to measure your value? Who established those terms? You say to yourself, I don't accept the terms of this conversation. And you ask, what terms would I choose? How would I measure a life well lived if productivity weren't the standard? I'm not normal. Why did you accept normality as something to aspire to? Who decides what's normal? Who benefits when you strive to conform? You say to yourself, I don't accept the terms of this conversation. And you ask, what if difference weren't a defect but simply variation? I'm not successful enough. Why did you accept certain markers of success as meaningful? Who defined what counts as success? What kind of life are you neglecting by pursuing these metrics? You say to yourself, I don't accept the terms of this conversation. And you ask, what would success mean if I defined it from my own values? You see the pattern. The phrase isn't about winning the argument within the established framework. It's about refusing the framework itself. It's about exposing that the framework isn't neutral, isn't natural, isn't inevitable. It's a construction of power, and you're not obliged to inhabit it. This is the most powerful use of the phrase. When you begin to identify the ways you've internalized others' structures of power and turn them into self-surveillance, self-criticism, self-control, Foucault called this care of the self, not care in the sense of self-care or self-indulgence, care in the sense of ethical attention to how you're constituting yourself, to how you're becoming a certain kind of subject. Care of the self means paying attention to the practices, discourses, rituals through which you produce yourself, and asking, do these practices liberate me or dominate me? Do they expand my possibilities or restrict them? Do they help me create a life I consciously choose or force me into a form serving others' interests? When you start asking these questions, something remarkable happens. You realize that many of the things you thought were you, your personality, your preferences, your goals, aren't really yours. They're the effects of power structures you've internalized. They're what Foucault called subjectivation, the process by which you become a subject. But here's the liberating part. If you were produced by structures of power, you can be produced differently. If your subjectivity isn't fixed but constructed, then you have the possibility of reconstructing yourself. Not completely, not in any way you want. You're always working with materials given to you, but within limits, there's freedom. There's the possibility of what Foucault called arts of existence, ways of stylizing your life, of making your own existence a work of art. This doesn't mean narcissism. It doesn't mean self-obsession. It means consciously choosing how you'll live based on values you've examined and endorsed, rather than unconsciously absorbed. And this requires courage. The courage to refuse terms everyone else accepts. The courage to live differently. The courage to endure the incomprehension, judgment, isolation that often comes from refusing dominant structures. Foucault called this parrhesia. Speaking frankly, telling the truth, even when it's dangerous to do so, even when it puts you at risk. And the first person you need to speak frankly to is yourself. You need the courage to tell yourself, I don't accept the terms of this conversation, even when that conversation is happening entirely inside your own head, even when you're so accustomed to those terms, they seem like the only way to think. So let me synthesize Foucault's complete insight. Manipulation is not primarily about lies or deception. It's about controlling the framework within which truth can be told. It's about establishing the terms, categories, norms that determine what can be thought, said, done. Resistance to manipulation is not primarily about better arguments or more evidence. It's about refusing the framework itself. It's about saying, I don't accept the terms of this conversation, and then proposing different terms. But this refusal has to be done wisely, without arrogance, with awareness that you too are positioned within structures of power, that you too might be reproducing domination without realizing it. And more deeply, you need to use this phrase with yourself. You need to identify the ways you've internalized structures of power, how you've become your own policeman, your own judge, your own examiner. And you need the courage to refuse those internalized terms and begin consciously reconstructing yourself. This isn't easy. Foucault never promised it would be. He lived a life of constant experimentation, of constant refusal of fixed forms of identity, of constant questioning of structures everyone else accepted as natural. And it cost him. He was misunderstood, criticized, marginalized, but he also lived with remarkable freedom, a capacity to reinvent himself, to explore possibilities others never considered, to create a life that was genuinely his. The phrase, I don't accept the terms of this conversation, is not a quick fix. It's not a formula solving all problems. It's an invitation to a different way of living, a way of living where you pay attention to structures of power, where you question what seems natural, where you resist domination without creating new domination, where you become, in Foucault's words, the work of art of your own life. This requires practice. It requires attention. It requires courage. But once you start seeing the structures of power operating in every conversation, in every relationship, in every thought you have about yourself, you cannot unsee. You become what Foucault called a specific intellectual, someone who intervenes in specific domains of power, who identifies specific structures of domination, who offers specific analyses of how power operates. You don't become a prophet proclaiming universal truths. You become someone who says, here, in this specific conversation, these specific terms are operating in a specific way that subordinates me, and I refuse. This refusal doesn't solve everything, but it opens a space where different terms can emerge, where different relations become possible, where you can begin becoming something different from what you were produced to be. And that, Foucault would say, is freedom. Not absolute freedom, not freedom from all constraints, but freedom within and against the structures constituting us, the freedom to question, to resist, to transform ourselves. If you've made it this far, you've already begun this process. You've paid attention to structures normally operating invisibly. You've started seeing how power works, how manipulation operates through structures, not just through lies. And now you have a tool, a simple but powerful phrase. I don't accept the terms of this conversation. Use it wisely. Use it with humility. Use it with courage. And remember, the first person who needs to hear it is yourself, because the deepest manipulation is always the one you exercise on yourself, and the deepest liberation comes from refusing to accept terms you never consciously chose. Subscribe to this channel where we explore the ideas of thinkers who help us see the invisible structures shaping our lives. Comment below what terms you're ready to refuse. And remember, no one can manipulate you if you don't accept the framework within which manipulation operates. The power is in the refusal, and the refusal begins now.